Deglutition is the process of swallowing. Deglutition, fancy word for swallowing, but this is the process at which food, a bolus of food, moves from the oral cavity into the stomach, right? Moves from the oral cavity down into the stomach. So during the process of mechanical and chemical digestion in the oral cavity, you create this bolus of food, which is essentially like a round ball of food. Now, if we look at sort of your oral cavity, and I'm going to draw this very crude in nature, let's say that this here is your oral cavity. Okay, now back here, we have our pharynx. So remember, your pharynx is broken up into the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Right? And we can sort of track this down. And then, if you remember from anatomy, this tube here will essentially split into two different tubes. Like so. It will split into the glottis and then the esophagus. Right? Now, if we look, when you have a bolus of food inside of the oral cavity, you're going to push that back, right, into the oropharynx. You're going to elevate your tongue, right, and push it back into the oropharynx. When you do so, the soft palate sort of is pushed upwards like this, and that soft palate blocks the nasopharynx so that food can't sort of move from the oropharynx to the nasopharynx. Now, as it moves down into the laryngopharynx, you're going to have a flap that is going to flap down during that process, and that's really because that bolus almost like serves as a trip for it and sort of like pushes it down. And that flap is your epiglottis. So that is your epiglottis. And what that does is that prevents the bolus of food from traveling down into the glottis and diverts it down into the esophagus, right? And so the epiglottis is the sort of almost like track designator inside of your GI tract, right? On which pathway that sort of content will take. Now, if we are breathing and we're just bringing in air, that epiglottis will flip open, right? It'll stay open sort of in this manner, like this here. And air can move down into the glottis and then down into the trachea and into the lungs. This epiglottis does sometimes fail, right? In some content, it's a lot easier for liquid content to move past that epiglottis down into the glottis, and it can actually lead down to your trachea and into your lungs, and we forcefully expel that via coughing. Now, it is possible for some solid content to get down into this region here, right? And you forcefully cough to expel that content. Sometimes you do it after a while, even when you're sleeping, and you don't even know about it, right? Now, if it stays inside of your lungs, it could create an infection. Sometimes very small particles can be broken down by your lungs, but usually not a sort of good scenario. Now, if we follow the esophagus down, right, the esophagus is going to pass through the diaphragm. So we'll draw our diaphragm here, and it is going to meet up with the stomach. Right? And so we'll draw sort of like the big stomach here like this. Right? Now, surrounding this area here where the esophagus meets the stomach is a sphincter. It's a high muscle tension area. and it's called the gastroesophageal sphincter, or some people will call it the lower esophageal sphincter. It's not a true sphincter, but it's caused by a high level of muscle tension right here. Now, during the process of deglutition, that bolus of food will expand that area, tension relaxes, and the bolus can move into the stomach. The reason that sphincter exists is because inside of the stomach you are going to have the stomach acid, right? And if it fails, that acid can move backwards up into the esophagus. And as we'll see later when we talk about the cells of the stomach have a protective coating around them so that the acid can't break them down. But the esophagus doesn't have that coating. So if the acid moves its way up into the esophagus, it will literally burn the esophageal cells. And this is located kind of close to the heart. And so this is what we call heartburn, or that's what heartburn is. Basically, literal burning of the esophageal cells caused by the acid that leaked up due to failure of that lower esophageal sphincter. This is can be problematic in people who have a lack of tension in that lower esophageal sphincter, and can become a common occurrence, which we call gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD for short. Gastroesophageal reflux disease. Right? And so that's how food moves from the oral cavity down into the stomach.